Hi guys, thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Clara. In today's video we are going to have a closer look at my sewing machine. I will explain how in general a sewing machine works in a very simplified way, and I will go over all the features and functions that my sewing machine has. Not all sewing machines are the same, of course, so some of them might have fewer or more features, but at the end of this video you will still have a great general idea what to expect from a sewing machine. So let's jump right into this. Here we have my sewing machine with the hardcover that came with the machine. Some sewing machines come with a hardcover like this, some have a soft cover only. I honestly like this one so much because I feel like the machine is very well protected with this. Now this cover has a nice feature. It has here this pocket, and that's where I store the power cable and the pedal for my machine. And here we have the beauty that's been hiding underneath the cover. So my current sewing machine is by the brand Brother and the model is named Innovis 100. It's a computer operated machine, which you can easily tell because there are all these buttons and there's a display. The threading system is hidden underneath this lid on the top. This drawer can be used in order to store some of my sewing supplies, and I can slide it out and back in. And I have to say this was quite an expensive sewing machine. I did not regret the purchase so far, but you do not have to go out and spend that much, especially not in the beginning. I used to work in all these years that I've been sewing with way less expensive sewing machines, and I always made it work, and I created some amazing pieces. One of them has been even featured in a magazine, so there's no need to spend that much. So let's start with the very beginning. So here on the side you have the power button to turn the machine on and off. There is a plug for the pedal and a plug for the power cable. And then there is here this wheel that can be used in order to lift or lower the needle manually. This machine has an additional feature. I don't necessarily have to plug the pedal in. There is a button that can be used in order to start and stop the machine. I personally don't like using it. I will come to that later. So right now I will plug both the power cable. Now we will turn the machine on. And then I will also plug the pedal. The pedal looks from the side like a wedge, and this is exactly the way you want to place it on the floor. So you want the lower side facing you and the elevating side is gonna be facing away from you so that you can use it just like a pedal in the car. Now that the machine is turned on, the display is also on, and you will notice that there are here several buttons below the display. I personally find that before we have a look at any other features, it's important to show this section of the sewing machine. So you have here this sewing table with this sled-like looking thing. That's a sewing foot. And then you have here the needle. And here on the side is a lever. When I lift the lever, I will also lift the sewing foot. And when I pull the lever down, the sewing foot goes also down. And you remember the little wheel on the side. If I turn it towards me, I would lower the needle so it would sink in the sewing table. That way the fabric would be secure. I have here a button that would lift the needle again, so I'm gonna do that. And with that in mind, we are going to have a look at all the buttons below the display on this sewing machine. Let's have a look at the display first. The display always shows a graphic of the current sewing stitch that the machine is set up to. Whenever I turn this machine on, it always goes on a regular straight stitch, which is why we currently see simply an interrupted straight line. So that's the symbol for straight stitch. Top left corner shows the sewing foot recommendation with a simplified graphic of the particular sewing foot. bottom left corner shows the position of the needle. So remember, we just talked about that the needle can go either up when you stop sewing or down. So that's the symbol for it. And right now the arrow points downwards, which means whenever I would stop sewing, the needle would be lowered. Next, we have here these two numbers. So the left number stands for either the position of the needle when you're working with straight stitches. That means how far the needle is to the left or to the right. Or it can mean when you're working with two-dimensional stitches, such as zigzag stitch or a stretchy overlock stitch or a buttonhole stitch, how wide the stitch will be. And the right number stands for the length of your stitches. Then we have here these black buttons directly below the display. With the very left button, I can change the position of the needle when I interrupt my work. So right now the arrow here points downwards, which means the needle would be lowered. When I would stop sewing, I can change that, and then the needle would go up, but I personally prefer having it lowered. Not all machines have this feature. If they don't have it, you can do something very simple. You simply turn this little wheel towards you when you stop sewing and lower the needle, and then it's done. So it's just a nice to have feature. The next button is also something pretty fancy. Not all machines have it, but this one does. And this button symbols the sew up, meaning the machine would do a sew up when it would start sewing in order to secure the first stitches. And then when I would be done, and when I would signal the machine with a button you will see later that I'm done, the machine would also do the sew up for the last stitches. So let's turn this on. And in addition to that, I can also tell the machine with this little scissor button that once it did the sew up, it should also chop the thread. Nice to have again, but something you get really quickly used to. And then we have here these pluses and minuses, and you probably guessed it. You can either vary the position of the needle for the straight stitch, so it would go further to the right in this case, or back to the left. Or if that were, let's say, a zigzag stitch, it could make the stitch wider or narrower. And then here this plus and minus goes for the length of the stitch. So let's go back to the straight stitch so I could make it longer. Next we have here these 3 rows with all the stitch programs that this machine offers. There are 30 in total, and each button displays 2 different stitch types. So this button is, for example, for the regular straight stitch. And if I would push it again, it would jump to the second program, which is in this case a certain type of a buttonhole stitch. You can also tell that the recommendation for the sewing foot changed. Now, right now, I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information, so I'm not going to go over all these stitches, but I will tell you which of these stitches are for me personally the most important stitches that I always work with. So I always work with a regular straight stitch and with a zigzag. I also like using a stretchy zigzag, especially for hemming of jersey clothing. Then I like using a stretchy overlock stitch, which looks like this, great for sewing together stretchy pieces. I also occasionally like using a stretchy straight stitch. And then obviously at least 1 or 2 types of a buttonhole stitch. And that's pretty much all I need in a sewing machine, and anything else is for me personally a nice extra. A very nice feature that this sewing machine has are these little pockets. So I saved here 2 different stitch types with certain settings that I use the most. So under the first pocket, I saved the stretchy overlock stitch with certain settings, and the second pocket keeps my settings for the stretchy zigzag, because these are both stitches that I have to adjust in both the width and length, while, for example, the straight stitch is easily adjusted because it's just the length most of the time, unless I really need to reposition the needle. So that's something that I also appreciate. Not all machines have this feature, but it's, again, very nice to have. Now let's have a look at these buttons. So this green button starts or stops the sewing machine when you're working without the pedal. I personally still prefer working with the pedal because I find I can be more precise and I can also adjust the speed a little bit better, and I react much faster with my foot than with my hand. But it's of course all about personal preference. Then we have here a button that can have two functions. Either you set up the machine that it will do automatically the sew up and maybe even chop the thread. So in that case, when you're done sewing, you have to push this button in order to tell the machine, hey, I'm done. And then the machine would do the sew up and maybe even cut the thread if you set it up that way. If that's not the case, then it would simply sew into the opposite direction. So normally when you are sewing, the fabric is moving away from you, so this way. But if you would push this button and you would be sewing, then the fabric would move into the opposite direction and the machine would sew the other way. Then we have here the button that lifts or lowers the needle. And we have here again a button with a scissor symbol, so that's obviously for cutting the thread whenever you need. And then we have here a button that you can slide into 3 different positions, and that is adjusting the speed of sewing, which is especially relevant when you're working without a pedal, when you're using just this button. Now, before we dive into the rest, let me explain how a sewing machine actually works in a very simplified way. So you always have 2 threads. One is somewhere on the top, which is in this case here, and the thread is always being threaded through different places, basically pulled through different places in order to be able to control the tension of the thread. And then you have the second thread somewhere on the bottom, which is in this case here, and the machine puts these 2 threads together into your stitches. So that's a sewing machine in a nutshell. So each sewing machine has somewhere a scheme of how to thread the sewing machine, and here this wheel controls the tension of the top thread. What you also see here is a place where I could place an empty bobbin. Then I would thread it a little bit differently, and then I could wind the bobbin so that I could have the same color of the thread on the bottom. How it works here and where to go for what is all explained in the video about threading a sewing machine. And here we have a second wheel, and this one adjusts the tension of the bottom thread. Here we have the most important part of the sewing table in detail. So you can see here again the sewing foot that's currently attached and the needle. So for the time being, I'm going to remove the sewing foot. I'll show you how in a minute. So you can see here these teeth. These are the parts that are transferring the fabric. They are moving the fabric as you are sewing. Here, when I slide this button to the side, I can lift this cover and then I could retrieve the bobbin. And if I would open all these screws, I would be able to remove this cover when I would, for example, want to clean the machine after a few projects, which is always very important, or when something would get tangled and I would want to retrieve it gently. This is the part that holds the sewing foot. It has an end here on the bottom that looks like kind of a little beak, and each sewing foot has a part like this, a little staff in the middle, and that's where the sewing foot is being attached. The part to which you attach your sewing feet is being operated with this lever, so you can either lower it or you can lift it, and there is a button on the back side. When you push it and the sewing foot has been lifted, it simply drops and then it's detached. Now, while we are facing the back, I will also show you this feature. So with this button, you can either lower or again lift the teeth that are transferring the fabric. So when the teeth are lowered, you can freely move the fabric into any direction you desire, which is great for quilting and creative stitching. Well, and since we successfully detached the sewing foot, I'm sure you want to know how to attach it again. So you have to make sure that this little staff is placed directly underneath this beak so that it can click in. And you hold it in place. Sometimes you have to move it a little bit back and forth, and then you lower the lever and the part simply clicks in. and that's it. This is a little bit different when using a buttonhole sewing foot, which is the sewing foot that I'm holding right now. It looks complicated, but it's actually not once you understood the principle. So you have here the little metal staff. So this is where you attach your sewing foot to the sewing machine. And then you have here in the back a drawer. That's where you place the button that you're gonna use for your piece. And you will slide it in, and you have probably noticed that these two markers have now a certain distance. And that is the help that your sewing machine needs in order to know how big the buttonholes are supposed to be. And for that, the machine has here this little plastic part that you can lower or lift again. So I'm gonna attach the sewing foot to the machine just like any other sewing foot. But then once it's attached, if I manage to attach it, I will lower this metal part and it will touch the first marker. Now the sewing machine will start sewing, and it will move this part to the front until the metal part will touch the back marker, and then the machine will understand, aha, time to return, and then it will start returning on the other side of the buttonhole. So that's the principle, again, a little bit simplified, but this is the difference. For this sewing foot, you will need to lower this metal part. Other than that, the attaching and detaching of sewing feet works the same for any other sewing feet. Next, we have here this lever on the left side. So that's for the automatic needle threading. I hope this is gonna work because I'm filming this for about a 10th time, because whenever I film, it doesn't work, and once I stop filming, it works. So once you successfully threaded the sewing machine, again, all about that in the video about how to thread a sewing machine, you grab the loose end of your thread and you pull it through these two sections. And then you'll lower this lever, and it worked. I'm so happy. And then it normally threads the needle, unless you are trying to film a tutorial, then it will strike. And then there is another really great feature, and that's this little beaky looking thing, and that's where you can chop your thread like so. And last but not least, we have here this drawer. So I can open it like so in order to access my sewing supplies. So there's place for several sewing feet. This is the screwdriver for these screws on the cover. I can have here 4 bobbins, and this section can be also lifted, so I have some other sewing supplies there. It's not necessary to go through every single piece that's in here. I think you get the idea. And when I close it, you can see it has a guide in both centimeters and inches, really practical, and I can slide this thing out, which will make this section narrower. That's great, for example, when you're working on tight pants or cuffs. And one last information about sewing machines in general. I personally find that it's better that before you lower the sewing foot, that there's always some kind of protection so that the sewing foot doesn't get lowered directly on these teeth. I know I've done it a lot during this tutorial, but that was just for demonstrational purposes. But in general, I find it better because I'm always afraid that the teeth could scratch the back of the sewing foot over time, and then the sewing foot could get caught in fine fabrics, like for example chiffon. So before I store my sewing machine, I always grab a piece of cloth and put it between the teeth and the sewing foot, and then I lower the lever, and that's how I store my sewing machine. So this was my sewing machine in a nutshell. As I've mentioned at the beginning, not all sewing machines are the same. Some might have more or fewer functions. The buttons might look a little bit different, or they might be placed differently, but it's always the same principle. So now you should have a great general idea of what to expect from a sewing machine. If you didn't get a sewing machine yet, and if you need an advice on how to pick the right sewing machine for yourself, there is a video as a part of this course in which I have explained how I personally choose my sewing machine, so that should help you out. I hope that this video has been helpful for you, that you enjoyed watching it. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and happy sewing!